Tonight we're in Dulwich, and welcome to Question Time. With me tonight, Kwasi Kwarteng, part of the Treasury team under Philip Hammond, a Brexiteer, he won't like me saying this, seen as by some as a future leader of the Tory party. Diane Abbott, a Shadow Home Secretary and MP for more than 30 years, one of Jeremy Corbyn's closest advisers. Mairead McGuinness, the first Vice President of the European Parliament. Since 2017, she's been in that job, an MEP for the Irish Fine Gael party since 2004. David Aronovich, writer, broadcaster, columnist for the Times newspaper, and the Canadian psychologist whose self-help book has sold 2 million copies and whose speaking tour excites controversy wherever he goes, Jordan Peterson. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And as ever on Question Time, if you're watching at home, you can be part of the argument. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our hashtag is #BBCQT. Now, let's have our first question, which comes from Kate Putnam, please.
Should stronger use of stop and search powers be employed to tackle our current knife crime epidemic? Well,
as we know, there's an appalling spate of knife crime in London and other big cities. Should stronger use of stop and search help? Jordan Peterson.
Well, if you're approaching this problem from the perspective of the social scientist, what you'd try to do is to track down the multi-factors that are at play. So who's doing it? That would be age range primarily, and likely gender, because the probability that it's all males is extremely high. Why are they doing it? Why has it accelerated in recent years? What do they gain from it? That's a major element of it. There's something going on there. Is it self-protection? Is it status? And so you want to do a causal analysis of the problem, and then you can target the solution properly. And the problem with like stop and search, for example, and this has already been touched upon, is that these are low probability events, so you end up stopping and searching a far larger number of people than are ever going to be involved in any crime, and then that produces side effects like accusations of racism or perhaps actual racism. We've seen that sort of thing happen in New York and in Toronto when stop and search and that, and now analogs of that were attempted to be implemented. But I'd like to know why it's happening. That's the first thing, because it's hard to solve a problem unless you've got the diagnosis right.
Okay.
So generally speaking, the people who are most likely to be violent are young men. And the violence that drives young men is often a consequence of status competition. And so one of the things that you see is that when societies are structured so that young men have a hard time finding a route to status that's say, positive and properly social, that they'll turn to status contests that are violent. And so that's another element to doing the causal analysis properly, is that if violent crime's on the rise, the probability is high that young men who are ambitious are having a hard time moving up the status hierarchy, and then they use other means to attain notoriety even. And that can be a powerful psychological payoff.
You agree with that?
I think that's partly true, but I think we can overanalyze what's actually going on in the sense that crimes that are happening are affecting people every single day. I mean, I read there were about 119 people that were killed in London. That's completely unacceptable. And to say that it'll take a generation, as the mayor, or 10 years, as the mayor was suggesting, I think is really defeatist. I think if you look around the world, if you look at Glasgow, as Diane mentioned, good policing, good policy, locally driven, we've got police and crime commissioners, locally, they can solve things. I mean, Rudy Giuliani didn't come to New York as the mayor and say, it'll take me 25 years to deal with crime. He dealt with it in a relatively short time. And I don't think...
It took 10 years in Glasgow.
I don't think
that's how long it took. They started their programme in 2005.
And it wasn't obvious. It wasn't obvious why crime fell in New York. Like, it's fallen quite precipitously across North America.
Broadly, I do not think it is an acceptable thing for a politician to say it'll take a generation.
What do you make of the point that Jordan made, that it's ambition frustrated by lack of opportunity?
I think there are a huge number of reasons why people...
What about that particular reason
I think there is a plausibility to it. I think that's completely right. I think people feel safer, they feel stronger, they feel a sense of worth, perhaps, sometimes. But I don't think that getting into sociological reasons is actually going to solve the problem as effectively as people would like to see on the street.
Well, there is something useful to say about punishment. Harshness actually doesn't seem to be much of a deterrent because people don't think they'll get caught. But likelihood of punishment is a deterrent. So if you can increase the probability that people who do engage in these crimes are definitely caught and prosecuted, so people know that they're not going to get away with it, that actually does have an effect on reduction of crime.
And that's about policing and resources.
Resources, you're back to resources.
But it's very easy to say...
John Peterson.
Well, some advice from a Canadian, I would say. Like, we've just about split our country 3 times with referenda. And the one thing I would suggest is that it's not a very good way of governing your country. It's like you can't tell when the damn things... You can't tell when they're binding. You can't tell when public opinion is shifted enough so that another referendum is necessary. You get endless arguments about whether the wording was appropriate. It's like you elect representatives to the House of Parliament to make decisions for a reason, and then when you turn that decision-making power in an arbitrary and unplanned way back to the general populace, I mean, I know they're sovereign and all that, but it's a very bad way of governing the country. And so I think you're in this mess because, well, because David Cameron abdicated his damn responsibility.
Yes, the video of the effigy of the Grenfell Tower on a bonfire was offensive. However, is it a crime?
This was the people who shared on social media the burning of a cardboard model of Grenfell Tower with paper people as well, and the police arrested them on suspicion of a public order offence. And the question is what's offensive a crime?
Oh, I know in Scotland the police had put up advertisements in the tube encouraging people to turn people in for offensive behaviour online. It seems to me, for example, if you're concerned about knife crime, then maybe one of the things you don't want to do is have your police investigating offensive speech. And one of the things I do see happening in the UK as an outsider that's really quite terrifying to me is that there are increasing restrictions put on people's ability to speak forthrightly, and that the consequence of that restriction and the criminalization of what hypothetically constitutes offensive speech is going to be a cure that's so much more worse than the disease that we can hardly imagine it. It's a dreadful thing to see that happening in the UK. And so, I mean, people say things that are reprehensible all the time, but we can't always agree on what they are. But to start to criminalize that's hypothetical.
Are you saying nothing that anybody says should ever be counted as a crime? Racist
well, there's incitement to crime. That should be counted as a crime and has been for a very long time in the British common law tradition. But other than that, you should be very careful about what you regulate as speech. Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to define hate? That's the real issue. It's not that there's not hate. There's plenty of it. The question is who defines hate and how is it prosecuted?
I'm not frightened of forthright speech. I'm quite a forthright speaker myself. But when you talk about who's going to define hate, you want to see the letters and emails I see day after day and tell me that's not hate.
I didn't... Wait a second. Now, hang on a second.
No, John.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
There was somebody fined under the Communications Act earlier this year because he posed a video on YouTube of a dog doing a kind of Nazi salute, and he shouted in the background, "Gas the Jews." And that was... He was fined, it was a criminal prosecution. Is that right, in your view?
I didn't think that was right, no. I think it was a big mistake. I mean, I followed that case fairly carefully, and you don't have to agree that what he did was comical or right, but to prosecute him criminally was a big mistake, and you're going to pay for it in this country.
Today,
We have to stop there, I think. Diane, briefly, just on that, as...
I would say that type of video with somebody shouting, kill the Jews, is an incitement to racial hatred, and that's a crime.
Okay.
Just please. It's about Jews. It's really important.
It may be important, but
80 years ago today, the precursor of the Holocaust happened. The night of the shattered glass, if I got the term. Kristallnacht. So don't underestimate what happens. It's only 80 years ago. And Jews were marched, their synagogues were burnt down, anti-Semitism was on the rise. This sentiment is happening again across Europe. And
all right, well,
I just would be really worried that people don't realise that.
Yes, but all right, fine. But that begs the question of whether that language should be criminalised, which is what the issue is. I'm not going to let you speak because we've reached the end of our hour.
What do you think?
I'm really sorry. And
it's not. It's
all right,
not
he says it's just a joke. Anyway, we have to stop there. I'm sorry.